Have you ever wondered what the septic system on an old 1900, like early 1900s house that's worth over $1 million looks like? Well, today I came across one and I think they're always so fascinating, and I want to share that experience with you. Talk a little bit about what the tank's made out of, what are some of the problems, and what is it currently doing? So let's go ahead and get into it. So the very first thing that we see when we walked up to the property was that they had a large 6-foot by 6-foot concrete pad. Now, this was a little bit more of a difficult property to record at, so I have some footage that I'm going to overlay on this while we discuss. So it's going to be a little bit different than our usual video style, but with this particular property, you have that large concrete pad. In the middle of that pad was an 18 by 18 metal lid. Now, that's your first clue that something's a little bit different. Back in the early 1900s, especially in Baltimore County, most of these systems would have been built on the property, right? So we've already discussed cinder block septic tanks, but this is where we run into something very interesting. So we pop off that lid, and on the inside of this system, we can see that it's actually a brick septic tank. Yes, not kidding. It's made out of red bricks stacked together. That's the septic system. Now, this was basically going to be used prior to the adoption of cinder block. Bricks were very common. You'll usually see these most commonly in western Baltimore. You won't really see it too much in northern Baltimore County or eastern Baltimore County. It almost always seems to be on the western side of the county. Don't know why, but that's just how they did it back then. So when you look inside, you can see that some of the brick wall is actually starting to fall apart and deteriorate. So the whole purpose for us going out here today was to determine what's going on, because there's some marshiness in the soil. So we can see that half the wall has actually fallen in to where you can see daylight into the tank. Now, where that brick is falling apart is where somebody has installed a new baffle. Now, the baffle is a PVC sanitary tee, and essentially that connects to a new outlet line. So somebody's done some work on this system at some point, but they kept most of the original system intact. When we look on the other end of the tank, we can actually see that there's a terracotta inlet pipe coming into the tank. Terracotta was very common back then. Terracotta is essentially like a clay pot material, right? It's very smooth, but it is incredibly fragile. So if you hit it just the right way, or you're not paying that much attention and you start planting trees over top of it, roots will start to work their way in there. Even if you're not really putting trees on the terracotta piping, it almost always ends up with soil and root intrusion. Terracotta piping is one of my least favorite pipe materials. It usually ends up causing the most headaches, in my opinion. Now, when it's smooth and perfectly clean, it works really well. It's basically like the first version of PVC, but it almost never looks clean and smooth. It almost always has problems. So if you have terracotta piping, it's a good idea to either get some kind of insurance or warranty to cover the repair whenever that repair comes up, or just preemptively replace that pipe so we don't have to deal with the backup in your house, because nobody wants that. Back to the system now. So we have water running from the house. We know that the pipe is open, so the terracotta line is at least passing water and solids through fine. Good, that's what we want to see. But once we start looking on the outlet side, that's where we start to find most of our problems. So we've already discussed that the wall has started to fall in. So that's where the local marshiness is coming from near the tank, is because the tank itself is falling apart. But once we start looking at where the absorption system is, we'll see that there's a dry well. Now, we've discussed dry wells in the past, but just kind of like a recap on what a dry well is. It's going to be a large pit, right? They're going to dig a giant hole. Usually in our area, they're 8 feet diameter. It'll be 6 to 10 feet deep, and they'll dry stack cinder block around, and they'll put stone on the outside of those blocks. Now, as the water goes into the tank, the solids will fall out of suspension, and then the water will go over and into the pit. The pit just acts as an open void to where the water can absorb into the surrounding soil. Very common. They were used basically all the way up until the early 80s in our area. Your area may still use it, and some areas around here, like Anne Arundel County, where they've got really, really tight lots, will still use dry wells. They're just not as common. Nowadays, we use drain fields. So we go over to this pit, and we see that they have a PVC cleanout. So again, somebody's done some work on this system at some point in the past, which is great. But once you pop it open, the water's all the way up at the top. And as you start walking around the pit edges and start probing, it's just super, super wet. So this thing's reached the end of its life, obviously. Now, I mean, it made it over 100 years, presumably. but it looks great. Discussing with the homeowner, because the county obviously has no records of anything, he said that as far as he was aware, somebody installed the pit in the 70s. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not. Usually pits were used back in the early 1900s. They weren't as common, but they existed, so I wouldn't have been surprised if it was a brick tank to a pit. So you may be asking yourself, what's the next step? Well, whenever you have a brick or cinder block tank, the next step is obviously to replace the system. There's not much you can really do about it. Well, you can just ignore it if you want it, but the state doesn't really like these systems, neither does the county. And the reason why is that they're not known for their structural integrity. Obviously, this one has a collapsing wall. You know, it's a system made out of bricks that was well over 100 years old. Whenever this is starting to happen, it's more of a concern for a health hazard. So that's usually why when you have a system like this, you end up having to replace the system. Now, the primary concern is going to be the surfacing sewage, as that's a health hazard and there's a stream nearby. So you run the risk of polluting the stream, and if one of the neighbors catches wind, then you as the property owner can get in a lot of trouble. It's very important to make sure as a property owner that you're not doing that sort of thing, right? Nobody's going to come actively knocking on your door, but if you're not taking care of your systems and you have sewage surfacing, all it takes is one person to notice or to say something, and then your day can get very, very problematic very, very quickly. So if you notice that you have marshiness, if you notice that the septic system's not playing nice, do the responsible thing, get it fixed up. That way you don't have to deal with fines. This particular homeowner noticed the problem. He's getting it evaluated. He's getting it remediated. So he's doing everything that he's supposed to do. Now, I know that septic systems are not cheap, right? It's one of those utilities that you spend a bunch of money on and you almost never get that value back out of the house when you sell it. So that's why in our state we have a bunch of different grant programs. So the biggest grant program that we have is called the Bay Restoration Fund. Your state may have a grant program, so I always recommend that if you have to replace a septic system or a septic tank, look at your local health department. Maybe give them a call. Say, hey, are there any grants out there to help offset this cost? Now, most contractors don't like dealing with it because there's a lot of paperwork, and so some of the other contractors will be like, oh, no, you won't qualify. But if you talk to the health department directly, they don't care. They'll tell you what the parameters are. They'll tell you what the eligibility requirements are, and they'll be able to help you work your way through the paperwork. So I always recommend, make sure you give somebody a call to see what you might qualify for, what you might not qualify for. The Bay Restoration Fund in our state is used to help older homes that are near the bay not put as much nitrogen into the bay and cause some problems. So that program exists to help these older houses or failing systems install more innovative and nitrogen reducing systems, which are very expensive compared to traditional septic systems. And most places you can qualify even if you're not necessarily near the bay. It's just that you get a higher priority the closer you are to water. So this particular house has a stream in close proximity to the home and the system, so they're probably going to be first online for getting that program qualification, at least for replacement. You never know till you talk to the county. But I thought it was an interesting one. I don't come across brick septic tanks that often, and I wanted to show you what it looked like and kind of discuss a little bit about what we found. If you enjoy videos like this, if you found any value out of this conversation, hit that like button, hit subscribe. I have more videos posted every day, and I look forward to talking to you guys tomorrow.